afternoon, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for coming today. It's on now. It's nice to see some familiar faces and a lot of new ones. We are recording the prepared remarks, but we'll turn it off in the Q&A. I'm Kurt Couchman. I'm Vice President of Public Policy for Defense Priorities. Before this, I was on Capitol Hill on the House side for 6 years. So in addition to the educational work we're doing under our C3, we do have some capability to introduce some ideas that kind of thing under our C4 umbrella. If you want to ask a question during the Q&A yourself, go for it. If you want to ask a question anonymously, then you can email me. My email is kurt.couchman@defensepriorities.org. If you aren't familiar with us, Defense Priorities is a newish foreign and defense policy think tank. There are a lot of foreign and defense policy think tanks in town. One of the things that makes us different is we're not only focused on operational efficiency, but also strategic efficiency. That is, what are our goals in the world? Obviously, Americans' prosperity, security, freedom, and of course we want to help like-minded countries as well with that. But we also need to get them to do more for themselves. And the whole concept of strategic efficiency is what today's conversation is really about, and how technology is changing the way that we need to think about things if we're going to maximize what we're trying to do in the world. We don't just focus on defense, we're focused on all the elements of statecraft, so diplomacy, trade, all of those things. We need to have an integrated foreign policy that's based on all aspects of our military, our diplomatic and political, and economic power. So, the other thing that's a little different is we're constitutionalists, so we want to see Congress take more responsibility for foreign affairs. I just had a piece in the Hill yesterday pointing out that under our Constitution, there's literally nothing, no power that the President has that Congress can't legislate on. Under the Elastic Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, Congress has the power to do legislation on any power of any government official, and Congress could do a lot more to shape the conduct of foreign affairs, if you all can agree anyway. That might be the real challenge. But for today we are focusing specifically on how technology shapes our strategy with respect to China. We have a lot of treaty allies in the region: Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, the Philippines, Australia, and we've designated all of them, plus Taiwan and Thailand, as major non-NATO allies. So we've got a lot of commitments currently in the region. We do believe that there is a possible strategic shift that would improve their security, increase our flexibility in terms of our military operations, and even reduce the risk of military conflict in the region. For that, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Eugene Gholz. He is an associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He works primarily at the intersection of national security and economic policy on subjects including innovation, defense management, and U.S. grand strategy. From 2010 to 2012, he served in the Pentagon as senior advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial-Based Policy. He's the co-author of 2 books: Buying Military Transformation, Technological Innovation, and the Defense Industry, and U.S. Defense Politics, The Origins of Security Policy. Additionally, he co-wrote a well-known international security article that coined the term restraint as a proposed grand strategy for the United States. Much of his recent scholarship focuses on energy security. He is vice chair of the International Security Section of the International Studies Association and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously held faculty positions at the University of Texas at Austin, Williams College at the University of Kentucky, and George Mason University. His PhD is from MIT. And Dr. Gholz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here and talking about the U.S. response to China's rise, how technology might give us options, how technology might offer us a better alternative than the kind of business as usual course that we're on with respect to achieving our interests and defense, national defense. Thank you all for coming. So going to dive into this. We're all on a tight schedule. So I don't think I'm surprising anyone by giving a quick summary of China's rise, the kind of situation that might lead the United States to want to adapt in some way our strategy. Or today I'm going to really focus not as much on the overarching strategy as on our operational approach and force posture. There's components of strategy that are a little bit more directly tied to military technology. And I'll get into that in a minute. But you know, the big picture, some very big picture things are happening in the world around us. This being the first of two that we're going to talk about. One is China's rise. So over the last 40 years, China's been on an incredible growth trajectory, and that's had certain implications for the world. And in particular, in the last 20 years, China's wealth has translated, their increasing wealth has translated to increasing efforts, increasing investment in military affairs. So some decisions that we made about how the United States wants to operate militarily and posture itself in the region 25 years ago at the end of the Cold War, at a time when we faced very little constraint or very little cost or risk to making certain choices strategically. Now those decisions, it might be appropriate to reevaluate them given the changing circumstances with respect to wealth and technology in the region. So in particular, China has this very, I suppose it's a felicitous phrase in Chinese. I'm actually not a Chinese speaker, so I can't translate this to Chinese, but the translation in English they talk about local war under informationalized conditions. This is not how they used to talk about military affairs. They had a doctrine of people's war, the idea that they had certain advantages based on having a great many people and sort of a low-tech approach to war. But in the last 20 years, they've started to adapt, and they're taking advantage of certain technological trajectories that we might talk about. And in particular, they've invested in what we call anti-access area denial capabilities. They've developed an operational concept to make it harder for principally the United States, but in principle, any other country to bring military power into the region and operate within the region. So the anti-access operational concept involves investing in quite a lot of defensive weapons systems. Think of in this region where China's on land and abuts the sea, land-based anti-ship cruise missiles, and now also anti-ship ballistic missiles, which create a gauntlet that you would have to pass through as you enter the region and threaten your ability to operate freely in the region, right? So during wartime conditions, right? This is talking about hypothetical scenarios where we're in an actual, a serious conflict. They've used their budget and the fact that they have access to certain technologies now that they might not have in the past to create a fairly robust, military affairs, everyone uses acronyms, right? So a fairly robust A2AD gauntlet that we face in the region. And that is a real change today and moving into the future from the time, 20 or 25 years ago when we made the decisions to adopt the kind of strategic posture that we have today. So, from the strategy perspective, Kurt actually, basically riffed on this slide very quickly in the introduction, right? The U.S. is trying to achieve certain things in our posture facing China's rise, and everyone agrees about what these things are, I think. And certainly today, my goal is not to challenge the idea that the purpose of U.S. national defense, the purpose of our investment in the military and in this area is to ensure U.S. security, prosperity, and liberty. We have these same goals, and we have friends around the world, in some cases treaty allies, in some cases countries that we have a good relationship and are committed to, where we also have taken the view as a country that we want our friends to have these benefits too, and we're concerned sometimes that countries that may have different aspirations or a different way of life could pose a challenge or pose a threat. And so we're going to make decisions about our military posture and operational concepts with an eye towards creating capabilities to protect these friends around the world, which we're going to focus today in the Asian context. But we want to do it at the lowest risk and cost. We have a variety of choices we could make, and we've been on a trajectory making one set of choices, and the main pitch today is to say we could make a different set of choices. At the operational level, we could have a more defensive posture rather than our existing operational offensive posture that would be lower risk and lower cost for the United States, but achieve the same goals of protecting our friends. So ultimately, the debate is not about the goals, it's over the means to achieve those goals. So strategy being a means-ends chain, the goals I don't want to shift today, I want to talk about how best to achieve them. And so the questions are, how close should the US military forces approach adversaries? So in this case, I'm not saying that we're not fighting a war today with China. I hope that never comes. China is not always an adversary, always implacably opposed to the United States by any means. But there are potential adversaries, and we're kind of planning for these contingency situations. And how close should military forces approach in those scenarios? And what's the best balance of effort between US effort and our friends and allies' effort to achieve our goals of strategic defense? And these questions, the answers to these questions, have important implications for kind of detailed military affairs, for how the military creates doctrine, plans to fight, how it operates, how it trains, but which are questions that are potentially of interest from a congressional oversight perspective and kind of an interaction with the military, but also much more directly for our congressional questions because they link to acquisition, investment, and force structure decisions about what kinds of forces we want to authorize, what we want to recruit, how many, and what kinds of technologies we want to prioritize to invest in, right? So both the R&D and procurement budgets of the defense budget. So currently, when I talk about kind of moving on a business as usual trajectory relative to some decisions we made when they were low risk and low cost decisions 25 years ago, the answer to the first question, how close do we sail potential adversaries? The answer is very close, right? So we made decisions that said, essentially, we want to preserve the capability, we want to have the capability to interpose American military forces between potential adversaries and our friends. Like, we want to take the lead on defense. We want to get between, China and Japan, or China and Taiwan, in a scenario where we have much more military capability. We have wonderful military capabilities, and we would want to take advantage of those by being up close and personal. And we, in fact, in response to the increasing Chinese capabilities and investments in anti-access area denial capability, we haven't sat still by any means. So we've developed I poked a little bit at the felicitous naming of the Chinese war under informationalized conditions. We have our own felicitous naming of these things, right? JAMGC, the Joint Concept for Access and Maneuver in the Global Commons. So this is the operational concept that the American military has been developing in response to anti-access area denial capability. And it's essentially involved very high-end investments in technologies and in high-end equipment that will respond to the increasing Chinese capability to threaten American forces as they approach the Chinese coast by stiffening the defenses of those American forces and changing the way that they operate to try to make it harder for the Chinese sensors to identify them or the Chinese missiles to strike them and hurt them as they approach the Chinese coast. So we've been developing and investing in quite expensive technologies and operational concepts to go into the teeth of the increasing Chinese defensive capabilities near their coast, because we're trying to maintain that ability to interpose and also to threaten the Chinese themselves. So our typical response, we'd like to have the capability. You could understand why countries would want to have the capability to, and particularly the United States, would want the capability to impose pain, to strike, to punish other countries militarily. And so we have maintained an operational concept that says we would like to have the ability to sail close to China and to strike at Chinese targets, even in the face of their increasing defensive capability. And then on the second question, what about the balance of effort? The balance of effort the United States has been comfortable with is a primarily U.S. taking the lead. So we have this great military. We want some support from our allies, but the primary burden of defending allies and friends is taken upon by the U.S. military. We have unbalanced alliance relationships. It's not exactly a partnership where each contributes. Certainly, there's no plausible description that says we would contribute equally, but the unbalance is quite large. It's a patron-client relationship between the United States and our friends and allies. Our spending dwarfs theirs in both absolute terms, the amount of money, but also in relative terms. So compared to, say, GDP, the percentage of the wealth that a country has, we're spending much more of our wealth to defend other countries than they are spending to defend themselves. That's our current situation. Of course, we have great confidence in ourselves, so there's a reason why that's an attractive circumstance, right? Like we're more confident in our capabilities than in anybody else's capabilities, so we're trying to accept more of the burden. This may not be, certainly not the only choice, and I'm going to try to convince you it's not the best choice. So the other key trend, other than China being richer and starting to spend more on its military that I wanted to talk about, is a technology trend, which is technology is moving in a direction for the United States and for other countries that sensors are getting better, and data fusion and battle management capabilities and the ability to process data to increase precision of weapons has been increasing quite steadily for a long time now and is moving further in that direction. So basically, you could think of it as intuitively, it's getting easier and easier to find a big hunk of metal floating on water, where it used to be that a hunk of metal floating on water could easily get lost in the vast expanse of the ocean. It's getting easier and easier to use sensor technology to find that and hit it from afar to keep it from getting close to the place that that hunk of metal, otherwise known as a U.S. Navy ship, wants to operate, right? And so the burden for defending or for hiding that U.S. Navy ship is going up simply because the technological capabilities that we're all familiar with in our own lives, sensors, processors, are actually also quite robustly applied in military affairs. So, this picture is of not actually the latest generation, but of a Chinese land-based anti-ship cruise missile that they have deployed quite large numbers of these, and their capabilities to threaten American ships or to overwhelm the defenses of American ships trying to approach China's coast are increasing. And it used to be that in order to have a well-functioning missile that could identify targets and hit those targets, you needed kind of rooms full of computers managing complex, very expensive computers managing very complex data. Now computers and data processing are so cheap that we willingly, intentionally blow them up. And it's not just we, the Chinese are willing to do this too, right? You put them in the missile, and the missile has much more capability on its own terms to make it hard to approach China. So a way to summarize this in kind of international affairs terms, or in military affairs terms, is to say that this technological trend is shifting the balance of capabilities between offensive and defensive capabilities towards the defense. The trajectory is making it easier to operate on the defense and harder to operate on the offense. Another way to think of that intuitively is to say something we all know to generally be true, but the balance is shifting further, is that it's harder to play away games than home games, right? So when you travel to somebody else's stadium, that's always tough. But when you're going there, it's getting relatively tougher. The advantage of the home crowd, knowing the wind patterns in the park, if you're a baseball player or whatever it is getting bigger and bigger because of the way technology is going. And partly this is because these kinds of sensor suites I'm talking about operate more effectively on the home turf where they've been trained on the home turf. They know what's usual activity and what's unusual activity, so they can identify that hunk of metal out there doesn't belong. It's not what we're used to seeing in this complex pattern of electronic emissions and radars and all the things that are going on in the region. That thing sticks out. Oh, it's the American fleet coming to bother us, right? Whereas if you take this sensor suite on the road to a place you're not familiar with the normal background conditions, it's harder to tell what sticks out. Oh, that's the American fleet, and what's normal. Oh, that's freighter traffic. It's the action of the waves. It's whatever the usual patterns of electronic interference might be in this region. Right? So sensors work better on the defense, and the more that military affairs become sensor intensive, the more it becomes easier to operate on the defensive than on the offense. It's also true, particularly at this kind of land-sea border that we're talking about, for the United States to project power into Asia as a primary way of defending our friends and allies. We do it by coming in on the sea on ships. Chinese get the benefit in reacting to that of operating on land. And there's been a traditional, it's always been true, that land forces can fight faster and have access to more munitions. They don't have to bring everything with them to the party, right? They can have warehouses full of munitions, whereas we coming in a ship, we run out much more easily. But in addition to that, this circumstance is getting exaggerated or getting to be more acute because of the cheapness of the munitions we're talking about. As the sensor and precision technologies get cheaper, the possible size of magazines grows. So the advantage of having the opportunity to stuff a full magazine on land grows relative to the advantage of coming across the sea. So this is a key trend that's making defense easier and offense harder. Remember, our current posture stresses the U.S. operational offense, even though what we're trying to achieve is on the defense. Another problem with the current U.S. posture that stresses the offensive operational concept is that it's not a good match for our actual goals in the region. So going back strategically to think about what the U.S. is trying to achieve, we actually have defensive goals, right? We may think we don't love the Chinese system of government, we wish it was different. We might actually want to do some things to change it, to try to encourage them to be more free and democratic and a bunch of other things. But that's not a military goal for the United States, right? We do this with other, we don't have an offensive desire with respect to our military with respect to China. What we want is to adopt the most efficient way, the lowest cost, lowest risk, highest probability of success way to kind of freeze the current situation, to prevent China from expanding militarily and damaging our relationships with our friends and our allies. So we have a defensive strategic task, or defensive strategic goal, but our current military posture relies on offensive capability of the US Navy to fight its way into the Chinese anti-access area denial belt, right? So to take an offensive operation in order to achieve a defensive aim. And because we have that offensive operational concept, those same forces that we are trying to use to defend our friends and partners and allies are also forces that the Chinese might view as forces that could be used to attack the Chinese mainland. And in fact, that operational concept, JAM-GC, consciously involves the threat to defend the American forces from Chinese anti-access area denial capabilities by trying to disrupt Chinese military operations on their homeland, right? So if we get into a conflict with China where we're going to try to bring forces or flow forces into the region, our operational concept calls for attacking radars on the Chinese homeland, for trying to disrupt their operations at those warehouses, a whole series of things that we view as part of our defensive strategic aims. But they involve raining missiles down on the Chinese homeland, and the Chinese might naturally not view that as so defensive, right? There's a distinguishability problem. They have trouble telling whether our goals are defensive or offensive based on our military posture. And of course, that is threatening and potentially dangerous. So the alternative is to recognize that the Chinese and everyone in the world, because of that technology trajectory, have improved defenses, but given our defensive strategic goals, we could focus on a more defensive defense as well. We could create what I call no man's sea. So this is not no man's sea during peacetime. There's lots of trade, lots of ships going around. But in terms of a wartime footing or a conflict situation, if it's hard for us to approach the Chinese coast, our goal, our job is also to make it hard for China to approach our friends and allies' coasts. We could develop the same kind of anti-access area denial capability for our friends and allies and create a situation where neither side wants to go into that region of the sea between China and our allies, between China and Japan, or China and Taiwan, or China and the Philippines. Create no man's sea where no militaries want to go into that. And so this would take advantage of the advantages of land forces and of the fact that we are on the strategic defensive to adopt a defensive operational posture. And these, by the way, are Taiwanese-built anti-ship cruise missiles that are actually quite high quality, right? They're a new model anti-ship cruise missile. The capability exists. It's just not purchased in large numbers, and it's not flowing into the operational concept the United States is using or advocating for the region, right? So we have the raw materials. We and our allies and partners have the raw materials to develop no man's sea. We're just choosing to continue on the business as usual trajectory of doing the offensive posture instead of the defensive posture. So the other key question to ask is who should take the lead on defending in this posture in Asia? Like, we're going to shift to a defensive posture. And it is certainly possible that the United States could choose to continue to have the United States take the lead, right? It's has a certain advantage, right? China is a great power with a large budget and a lot of money, and you might want to say, well, look, the United States is equally going to defend. We have a large budget, we have the power to buck up our allies and make sure that everyone understands China can't overwhelm them. So there's an attraction to this, but there are some real disadvantages to it as well. So, anytime the U.S. Takes the lead on defense, it's going to require the flowing of forces into the region. It's going to give us the problem with that distinguishability and the potential that from China's perspective, it's going to look like we might be coming for them as opposed to just defending our friends and allies. And it always should give us pause when our military strategy looks like it's leaning into the possibility of a great power fight, right? We don't want to lean into that prospect. That's a last resort, ultimate bad news if we end up in a great power fight. We want to try to do things to minimize the risk of that level of conflict. It's also true that any time, even if the U.S. says we're adopting a more defensive posture and a defensive operational concept, but we're taking the lead, the Chinese will understand. They will see the strategic circumstance that says, for the U.S. to project power this far and take the lead, it's always going to be tempting for the United States to, instead of trying to defend ships and defend our approaching forces against incoming missiles, once those missiles are launched, it gets harder and more expensive and more risky to defend against them. There's an operational consideration that says it feels more efficient to shoot the archer, not the arrow, because one archer shoots many arrows, right? So it's always going to feel attractive to the United States to do what our current posture says we're going to do, which is rain missiles on the Chinese homeland to shoot their archers, right? Their archers potentially threaten our forces in an operational scenario, but we got to take out the archers, right? But of course, China, knowing that there's always a temptation on our side to take out the archers, is always going to be afraid that even if we say we want to have a defensive posture, they're always going to have in the back of their mind the thought maybe the U.S. lead means they're going to want to turn to the offense, the operational offensive. So the alternative is to have the U.S. allies take the lead, to take advantage of their home turf, their home bases, the fact that they have an incentive to really defend themselves and say, look, our allies should develop a robust A2AD capability. Our allies should invest in anti-ship cruise missiles, better radar nets, different operational concepts that prepare them to fend off the Chinese and to take the lead rather than U.S. forces flowing in and taking the lead. And this might, U.S. saying we want to commit to this ally-led defensive operational concept might be the kind of thing that would change the incentives of the Taiwanese government, which has recently turned to say, yes, they want to increase their defense spending, but to not only change the amount they're spending, but what they spend on. They might want to buy more of those Taiwanese-produced anti-ship cruise missiles rather than buying more surface ships that would cooperate with the U.S. Navy, for example. And look, if you're really concerned about Taiwan's ability, if they might be overwhelmed by the size of China, they need the backing of the United States, you might ask yourself, is the best way for the U.S. to back them with our checkbook or with our ships, right? So if we want to make sure China has enough missiles and buy enough missiles from their factories, or from our factories, to defend themselves, well, we can do that. We have the checkbook. The question is spending the money to buy missiles a better option, Taiwanese missiles, or is spending the money to buy American ships and sending those ships into harm's way the better option? And the key is the takeaway, having the indigenous forces take the lead on defense takes advantage of the operational defense, takes advantage of the technology trajectory that favors sensors and favors precision technology. It leads to distinguishable forces, right? Whereas the U.S. forces flowing into the region might look to the Chinese like offensive forces. Missiles that are defending Japan on Japanese islands from approaching Chinese ships don't have the capability to threaten the Chinese homeland. They're clearly defensive systems as opposed to offensive systems, right? There's not a problem where the Chinese are confused about whether the United States is coming for them. They know that Japan buying anti-ship cruise missiles is only defending Japan, not attacking China. It clarifies the diplomacy of East Asia. So look, this is the summary where this leaves us, right? Given the technology trajectory, the U.S. can keep spending a lot of money, can keep investing in very high-end technological capabilities and taking risks to maintain our current offensive operational posture, right? But that U.S.-led defense, JAMGC, those kinds of activities I'm talking about, rely on the operational, offensive, indistinguishable forces and threat of great power war as the first option, right? This is a risky, high-spending trajectory, and the alternative of emphasizing indigenous defense looks much better, looks much more consistent with where technology is going, right? It relies on the operational, defensive, distinguishable forces, and the people taking the lead are smaller powers, not the guerrilla United States that has all the capability that potentially everyone is nervous about, but China knows for sure. They're not sure whether the United States wants to actually attack China, but they know for sure that the Philippines are not coming for China, right? And so clarifying that can make it much easier to understand that, look, we want to preserve the status quo. We're not threatening you in a direct military way. And so what I'm suggesting, and what I hope we can talk about for 20 more minutes in some questions, if you have some questions, is that, look, given the way technology is going, and China's budget, but mainly it's a technology story, the cost of the current strategy and force posture is increasing while the benefit is decreasing. And we're a rich country. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, right? It's hard to scramble together a budget. But if we want to clarify this is really important to us. We could spend more on defense. We could spend a lot more on defense and keep making this possible for the future. But there's a more efficient way to achieve our goals. And we want to, I think, we'd be better off taking advantage of that by shifting our operational concept and our acquisition investment to focus more on these kinds of defensive systems. So thank you, and I look forward to some questions.